Welcome to this journey where we dialogue with thought and heart leaders to share their reflections on human condition and how to improve them.
It would be very, very interesting for me and the listeners to know, what are your early childhood memories?
That's where you're going to start? Start at the beginning. I think I can answer that question in a lot of different ways depending on what aspects of growing up you wanted to focus on. I would start very practically with being really interested in math and science and being really interested in art. That was, I think, the main theme of growing up for me, was living in those two worlds kind of at the same time, but having no crossover, kind of during the day being into math and science and one of the few kids that actually really enjoyed school and loved learning, that sort of thing, and then would come home and do a lot of music and pen drawing, that sort of thing. So Lego building, a lot of that artistic side, but the Legos actually turned out to be a hint at the future, because Legos are this great creative tool, but they're also engineering skill, right? You have to have the thing actually structurally hold itself together. And I didn't realize it for another 20 years or so. It took until I was 23 to start working in those worlds together, where I was actually doing robotics, which was for aesthetic installations, art installations, but had to function in certain ways, so I had to know the engineering and started to kind of learn a bunch of different forms of engineering. But I'd say that's the main theme of my life. It's funny that you ask it that way, because a lot of the work that I've been doing in the last 3 years of my life has been about going into the things that we implicitly learn in our childhoods about what is allowed and what isn't allowed in our lives, and uncovering the forms of emotional repression that we learn, whether we're told about it or not. And I didn't even realize how deeply aspects of my childhood, which was generally a really wonderful, I have a lot of gratitude for my childhood, but even in a great childhood, there's little micro traumatic events that are happening every day, and depending on your personal sensitivities, they will affect your own system. And a lot of the work that I've done historically in the last 10 years or so was all meditation oriented. And as that started to clear my mind, I got more and more interested in my body and the fact that there were forms of emotional repression that I couldn't even understand why they were there. Why it was very hard for me to express anger. Why would that be? But then as I've looked more and more deeply into my own upbringing, those kind of circuits were built really early in my body. And so I've actually found that for me, it wasn't enough to work on the mind. It has actually had to be done in concert with working on the emotional system and the somatic system, where all of those emotions live. That's a kind of a weird first answer to your question.
No, it's fascinating, Jeff, and it's nice that you mentioned that a lot of things we sort of learn as we grow up. And there are certain structures in which we learn, and we sort of hold them very rigidly until such time that we hold them in meditation and reflection and try to reverse engineer them and see where do they come from, and look at it from lateral drilling perspective. As a teen, a lot of people go through a lot of challenges in terms of you have first love, you have challenges in terms of relationships, and also in terms of framing a worldview. I think teens are the most idealistic, I would think, or I don't know, I'm wrong on that, but I think teens comparatively are more idealistic. What was your worldview back then, and how did you manage your relationships back then?
Well, the first thing I'd say is if anyone as an adult is having any kind of relationship issues, to look at what they implicitly learned from their family structure about relationships, because I have found that any issue I have is just it's back to the same thing. It's like you implicitly learned how family structures work, how love works, how love is conditional or unconditional, what the boundaries are, all those sort of things you're learning when you're 1 year old, but no one's talking about it. It's just energetic. You're just feeling these things are happening. So what was the other part of your question?
The other was framing a worldview so that you can.
The worldview.
Yeah.
The worldview. Yeah. For me, I was, I would say when I was 16 is when I knew the most about the world that I've known in my whole life, and it's been all downhill since then. I feel like every year that goes by, I know less and less. But I was very much raised on physics and math and that paradigm, and that led me. I was brought up in a Reform Jewish family, but by the time I was 10 years old, I was arguing with my teachers about the physics in the Torah, and the fact that like, when bushes burn, they oxidize, and they can't burn without oxidizing, that sort of thing. And I think there was a really deep opportunity that was missed in my mind personally. When I was 10 years old and I was arguing about those things, there would have been a great opportunity to be told, that these stories are metaphors for something that is not able to be put into words. But instead, they argued about the technicality of the story. And so I just jumped off the boat. I was done. It didn't line up with everything that I knew about the way that science works and that sort of thing. Had they actually said these are metaphors for things that are unspeakable, that might have actually put me into a super introspective path really, really early, where, when you're 10 years old, your mind is so open and malleable, right? And so if you're actually given that kind of idea at the right moment in your life, it can actually spring you into probably mystical states pretty quickly. You haven't built all the kind of calcified belief systems over your whole life. But instead I got into an antagonistic relationship with spirituality, and I think that lasted for another 20 years. And during that 20 years, I would say my belief system, my worldview was very much materialistic, current paradigm of physics, even though there are now, from my view back, there are amazing gaps in our knowledge in physics. You could say not even holes in the story, but the whole story sits in a gigantic hole of how does this actually line up with my personal experience? Where are the verbs in this paradigm, right? The paradigm of materialism is a bunch of nouns and a bunch of fields, and my experience is all verbs, and every noun that I know is only through verbs, right? I only know that I'm talking to Hemant right now because of sight and hearing and the actual activity that's happening there. So I would say in my 30s is when all of that kind of worldview and paradigm started to break down, and I started to become much more open about listening to consciousness for certain answers, and not just taking what my forefathers said was the way things were, and actually doing a scientific process of inquiry, but on reality itself.
Wow, so fascinating. So you said a bunch of things there, and I have curiosity around them. One is this thing. Am I hearing you say that all is verb, that there is?
It's not to discount, that this is a phone or whatever. It's really useful for us to be able to talk to and refer things. But the primary knowledge that I have is through sensory experience. Everything I know about the world is validated through my own experience, and that experience is verb. Right. It's activity, right? I only know this because I feel, and because I see, and because sometimes I hear it. And so we definitely we grow up hearing this all the time, that there are objects and objects that contact each other, and consciousness doesn't even enter the picture of the paradigm, right? That's actually one of the huge fights that's happening in the physics world right now, is like, where the heck is consciousness, right? I know that I'm having this existence, but how do you get enough atoms together that don't feel existence and suddenly feel existence? Like, that's a huge question. It's a huge gap, and people fight about it all the time. But I wonder sometimes when you're in a tribal culture and you haven't learned all of these kind of things, what's your actual experience like, right? Do you actually objectify the world in the same way, or do you just follow the desire and the whim of your sensory experience in a much more clarified kind of manner? And I don't know, because we learned a lot of stuff too fast to remember what it's like to be in a tribal kind of consciousness. But that's something that is always really curious for me. It's like the kind of thought experiments I really like are when you strip away certain elements that we take for granted, what's left? That to me is a really interesting kind of scientific inquiry way to do a form of meditation, which some people call direct inquiry. And if you, for example, if you think about a newborn's experience on the first day of their life, what is that experience? What is shared with their experience, with my experience today, and what is different? And what I know for sure is they didn't have the ability to think about the future or the past because they hadn't taken any data about time yet, and they didn't have any language. So all the things I think about all day, which I think about in English, I learned over the first couple of years of my life, and they didn't have that. And when you look at the neuroscience, they didn't even have a distillation of seeing and hearing and touch and all those senses were actually interwoven and hadn't pruned themselves into separate compartments yet. And so obviously a baby that's born, that's 1 day old, is having an experience, but 99% of my experience today is not part of that experience. So then the question becomes, well, what was it like? And maybe some of that experience is actually happening right now, but until I actually look at underneath all those other layers, I won't really have a reason to notice it.
That's interesting. Very interesting. So, Jeff, could we then say that from the time that we were born, and then as we grow as a child and we move towards adulthood, are we in this constant process of discretization? I don't know whether that's a term that we can use, or I think the term that you use is differentiating things and foreground and background and objects and situations, and sort of compartmentalize them and hold them as entities and trading them all the time. Would that be a good inference from what you're saying?
I wouldn't say that's the only thing that's happening. If you read some of Ken Wilber's work, he refers to the kind of oscillation between differentiation and integration. And this happens in our sensory system when I'm differentiating that this thing is different than this thing, but then I start to get classes of objects. All of a sudden there's tree, which actually doesn't exist as an object. It only exists as an integration of me seeing hundreds of objects and kind of classifying them in an abstract way.
Right.
And once I do that, I can say, oh, now there's all these different types of trees. So I've differentiated those again. But then I can actually reintegrate, oh, well, there's the kingdom of life. And I can say, oh, the trees fit into a kingdom of life. So I think perception is a constant oscillation of differentiation and integration, or more generally just pattern recognition, which has those kind of two bidirectional life.
Yeah.
But the same thing happens in our model of the universe, where you have these subatomic particles, or even before that you just have this kind of, who knows, I don't know enough of the most recent particle physics to know what the most recent theory is, but you have some kind of quantum foam, some totally vacuum state that starts to emerge in patterns that generates what we see as subatomic particles would start to look different, and then the combination of those gives us atoms, the differentiation of those gives us the periodic table, the combination of those gives us molecules and carbon chains, differentiation of those starts to create cellular structures, reintegration gives us organisms, differentiation gives us societies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems like there's this just back and forth, and that can happen in all these different directions, right? With meditation, it happens in the opposite direction, where you're actually, to use Sri Aurobindo's term, you're involuting, you're taking this evolutionary process and you're actually looking back down and digging your way back to the beginning. So you're kind of noticing the integrations and differentiations and ripping them apart and looking underneath, and yeah.
And it seems what you just referred to is the scales of existence in some sense, and then there is so much of dynamic activity, intrascale and intrascale, that's going on, and it's so I think it's so overwhelmingly gigantic, this whole thing is, and yet with so much of dynamism, somehow we get to see, we seem to be getting a lot of things done amongst us as a society.
Are we?
Well, seemingly so.
Seemingly so. Yeah, there's a lot of activity.